Apologies for that. Yeah, let me see here. Okay, good. Looks like it hasn't been crashed for that long. But yeah, so what we're talking about here is just kind of what we're trying to secure. So we're trying to keep the network secure, make it so wireless doesn't become a conduit for network attacks. We're trying to encrypt our wireless data. And where I was, and with wireless data encryption, we have a number of different encryption protocols. We have the old WEP protocol that goes all the way back to the start of Wi-Fi. We have WPA, which used the TKIP, Temporal Key Integrity Protocol. WPA2, which used the AES CCMP protocol, the advanced encryption standard using the CCMP protocol. We have WPA3, which we're going to talk about momentarily. But I was just mentioning that non-data information seepage can also sometimes be an issue, and just sharing that with you here. One of the websites, I'll put it in the chat area here. It's weigel.net. That's a website that can allow you to kind of search for Wi-Fi networks by SSID. And so if you have a Wi-Fi device that is wirelessly sending out your SSID, if someone nearby has the ability to capture what your Wi-Fi device is looking for, it can potentially kind of lead to a vulnerability. Let me show you what I'm talking about here. I'll bring up the Weigel website to share with you all. I'm sure you can go on it yourselves. You do have to have an account to go on Weigel, so I don't know, just in case any of you all are not interested in registering for Weigel, this will allow you to see it a little bit here. Let me bring that in the picture properly. I guess I should have probably set this up earlier. There we go. So yeah, this is the Weigel website here. Bring it down a little bit. And what you have the ability to do on the Weigel website is, search by SSID. For example, a friend of mine used to have a production company called Rough and Tumble Productions. They used Rough and Tumble as the SSID against my protests. And let's see here. Oh, sorry. I got to do the search. There we go. So I'm doing kind of like a worldwide search here. And what I was telling my friend at the time about this Rough and Tumble network was Rough and Tumble is a very unusual SSID. I would say it's not particularly likely that you're going to see. Let's see here. We want to do a worldwide. This doesn't look. This is like showing San Francisco only. Let's see if we can. There we go. So yeah. So what I was telling my friend who had this production company named Rough and Tumble is you might not want to use Rough and Tumble as your network name because Rough and Tumble is such an unusual network name. And if you use it as your network name, then someone who goes on this website who knows that your phone uses the Rough and Tumble network name, they might be able to locate precisely where your office is. And as you can see here, when I search for Rough and Tumble, there's only two networks. There's one that you can hopefully kind of see it there is right here in Los Angeles. You see the West Hollywood area, the famous Pink's hot dogs, etc. The other one looks like it is in England. Is that where we are here? Maybe I'm completely wrong about that. Maybe that's like, oh, no. Sorry. That's Portland, Maine, apparently. Yes, looks like Portland, Maine. So, perhaps you can imagine the scenario. I'm walking down the street. My phone's not connected to a Wi-Fi network. My phone is sending out these messages saying, hey, I'm trying to reach the rough and tumble SSID. If someone is able to capture those messages, and there's a ton of free and easily available capture tools available for Wi-Fi traffic, if someone captures those messages, then someone could go to Weigel.net and, assuming they have an account, do what I just did, just do a worldwide search, do a search for rough and tumble, and notice there's only 2 results here. There's this network, which I happen to know is my friend's network. His office was on the corner of Sycamore and Romaine, right between Sycamore and Romaine, right here in this building that now is apparently Fort Street Studio. Used to be Rough and Tumble Films was there, but yeah, it looks like Fort Street Studios there. This Blink charging station, that's a Kaiser Permanente office, but maybe there's a charging station down in the on the parking of that that allows that. So the bottom line is someone could easily find out kind of where my friend's office is located, and that's what we mean by information seepage, just kind of giving potential hackers more information than you would like them to know. That's what we call information seepage, and that's the type of thing that can happen with certain types of non-data traffic, and that's that's what kind of makes that a concern. Sorry, give me just a moment here. Lost my connection to my little PowerPoint viewer. There we go. Okay. And then kind of the third area that we want to secure. So we want to keep the network secure. We want to keep our wireless communications secure, both data and non-data. And then the third thing we want to keep secure is devices. We want to make sure the things that are stored on the device are secure. We also want to make sure that someone can't get access to our device to potentially impersonate our device. I was just reading, in fact, about a person who had this happen with the Rogers cell phone company in Canada. An acquaintance of mine who lives and works out of Canada had his SIM card replicated. So someone was able to get enough information to replicate the SIM card from this person's cell phone. And then by having the SIM card replicated, because the person uses two-factor authentication for everything, two-factor authentication where you get the little text message that comes in to confirm, yeah, I'm this person, yeah, I want to change my password. Because 2FA was used, all over the place by this person, whoever this hacker was able to do all sorts of stuff, was able to, I forget exactly what it was. It might have been like bank account access, or it might have been opening a credit card and running up credit card charges. But the point is, it all started with just impersonating this person's cellular device. Now, I realize Wi-Fi is not exactly the same. Usually this 2FA authentication comes down to the use of a phone number. It's also a big reason why I try to avoid SMS-based 2FA as much as possible, unless the organization absolutely requires it. Like, for example, with Twitch, I have to use, well, maybe there's a way to turn it off, but at least the default is that I have to use 2FA to log in. If I can avoid it, I do, because otherwise, if someone replicates my cell phone, and if someone knows that I use the email address ben_miller@icloud.com, they can go into a lot of different places and just put in that email address, put in my cell phone number, receive the text on their stolen cell phone, and be allowed to change passwords. So I'm a bit of a 2FA hater because of that, especially SMS-based 2FA. No doubt about that. Again, it goes back to sort of my libertarian point of view on security. So in any case, those are the things that we're trying to keep secure over wireless. And so now we want to get into talking about kind of where does WPA3 come in? What is WPA3 going to do for us? And it does affect all three areas. It does affect the network. It does affect wireless communication. It does affect device security. But it doesn't necessarily affect all three in all scenarios. And a big reason why this is WPA2 sort of already does a pretty good job with that. And I just want to do a little bit of a brief explanation of what WPA2 is doing, just in case there are folks that are not particularly familiar with WPA2. For WPA2, there's two types. There's WPA2 Personal, which is sometimes called WPA2 with a pre-shared key. And then there's WPA2 Enterprise, which I'll get to in a moment. With WPA2 Personal, or with the pre-shared key, a passphrase, or I suppose you could call it a password, somewhere between 8 and 63 characters, is used to authenticate client devices. This passphrase is used to derive a PSK, or pre-shared key, and the pre-shared key is something that we call the PMK, stands for pairwise master key. And this pairwise master key is what I like to call key material. And what I mean by key material with this pairwise master key is that my little client device here, let's say I'm using a laptop, will have this PMK, again, derived from whatever passphrase I'm using on a WPA2 personal network. My access point will also have the same PMK. And then my access point and my client device will engage in something called the four-way handshake. Whoops. Another way I've seen this referred to is WPA2 authentication and key management. You might also see it referred to as RSN authentication and key management, or 802.11i authentication and key management. There's a number of different ways that this may be referred to, but the bottom line is this little four-way handshake, or this little key management, makes it so that this PMK is used to create actual encryption keys. And that is plural keys. There in WPA2, there's an encryption key used for basic data. There's an encryption key used to authenticate the client device. There's an encryption key used to encrypt other keys, if other keys have to be transmitted across the wireless channel. There's something called a key encryption key that encrypts other keys. So there are multiple keys. This is plural. But the bottom line is this encryption key gets created. So the idea there is, number one, we have authentication. We have protection of the network, because you must have the passphrase correct in order to be able to connect. Number two, we have protection of wireless communications because of those encryption keys. We have encryption of our wireless data. And then we sort of have protection of devices. The protection of the devices kind of comes with the passphrase-based authentication. The idea is that people who don't know the passphrase won't be able to get on the network to try to attack other devices. And people who don't know our passphrase won't be able to set up a fake network, to set up what sometimes is called an evil twin attack, in order to trick our client device into connecting to the bad guy's network. So that's kind of what WPA2 Personal does. With WPA2 Enterprise, it's a little bit different. WPA2 Enterprise uses the 802.1x port-based authentication protocol, along with the extensible authentication protocol for authenticating the credential. The essential way this works, 802.1x is a structure for authentication. Extensible authentication protocol is the authentication protocol, meaning extensible authentication protocol defines what type of authentication, whether it's certificate based or password based or I don't know, biometric based authentication, whatever it might be. And the authentication protocol also determines which messages travel back and forth. What, is it the access point or the server or the client or whatever that's going to sort of send the first thing. The way WPA2 Enterprise works is there's a little client device just like we had before. There's an access point just like we had before, but then there's also an authentication server. And the authentication server is typically going to be a Radius server. There are other authentication servers. Essentially, it has to be a AAA server. It has to be an authentication, authorization, and accounting server. And it has to be a server that supports EAP. Radius supports EAP. Radius is a AAA server. And so Radius is a very common authentication server type. Radius is a authentication protocol, an authentication server protocol, I should say. And it's standardized. There's multiple different vendors that use Radius servers. Microsoft has a very popular Radius server. There are open source Radius servers out there. There are cloud-based Radius servers out there. There's Aruba has the ClearPass Radius server. That's what we used at USC. There's many, many different Radius servers. In any case, the way things work with WPA2 Enterprise is some type of credential. It could be a username and password. It could be a certificate. It could be something else. Some type of credential is configured on the client device. The credential is known by the authentication server. Again, whether that's the username and password, whether that's the certificate, whether that's some other method of authentication. So those credentials are known on those two places. And what happens here is when our client device tries to communicate with the access point to essentially say, let me in, the access point says, hold on, I'm not going to let you in just yet. I'm going to say that Ben wants in. So the access point is going to kind of offload the authentication to the server. Then at that point, the server and the client device engage in whatever EAP protocol has been specified. Popular EAP protocols include PEEP, that stands for Protected Extensible Authentication Protocol. Another popular one is EAP TLS. That one is certificate-based. That's EAP with transport layer security. So the bottom line is the client has this credential, the server has this credential, the access point says, hey, I got a client who wants to connect. Let me let the server handle this. There's this EAP protocol, and then at the end of the EAP protocol, the client has that PMK that we talked about earlier. The server has that PMK. And, technically, it's a little bit more complicated than this. Technically, the client has something called the MSK, or Master Session Key. The Master Session Key is just the session key, or depending on how you want to call it, you can call it the master key from the SSL protocol or from the TLS protocol. In TLS, I always forget which is which. I believe it's that SSL calls it the session key. TLS calls it the master key. It might be reverse. It might be that TLS calls it the session key. SSL calls it the master key. But the bottom line is there's this little key, this key that is essentially used to to encrypt other keys, to set up encryption, so to sort of protect communications during the authentication process. But in any case, this master session key is created, and from the master session key, the PMK is derived. And basically, the PMK is the master session key in most cases. But the way the protocol is set up is it's really the master session key that's at the authentication server. The master session key is then derived into a PMK, and then the PMK is sent to the AP. So now you're in exactly the same position that we were in with WPA2 Personal. If I flip back to that real quick. In WPA2 Personal, my AP had a PMK, my station had a PMK, my client station, and there was a four-way handshake to create encryption keys. In WPA2 Enterprise, same basic thing now. My AP has a PMK, my client device has a PMK, and now there's going to be that little four-way handshake to create encryption keys. That's the idea there. And whoops, sorry, I just realized I kind of messed it up there again. It's the MSK, or master session key, that is used to create the PMK. So the bottom line with this is WPA2 is server-based authentication. Sorry, WPA2 Enterprise is server-based authentication. WPA2 Personal is password-based authentication, meaning no server. And then we kind of have a third option, so option number one being personal, excuse me, which means no authentication server, just authentication at the access point. There's WPA2 Enterprise, which means there's an authentication server. And then there's Open Networks, which basically means anyone connects. And so WPA3 affects all three of these options. The big protocols with WPA3, we'll get into the details on them a little bit later. But the idea is that with personal authentication, the network is a little bit better protected because the WPA2 personal passphrases are more difficult to crack. WPA2 passphrases could be cracked with a relatively simple dictionary attack. It was a simple but time-consuming dictionary attack, but it wasn't particularly complicated to at least set up a WPA2 personal passphrase attack. It might take a long time for the passphrase to be derived, to be cracked, but it was a relatively simple attack to set up. WPA3 personal makes the cracking of passphrases much more difficult. It makes it borderline impossible. I'm hesitant to say fully impossible. I want to bring up a little kind of a reference for you all. This is a paper that you can freely download from anywhere. Let's see here. And unfortunately, I am not seeing it come up the way that I was hoping. Okay, sorry about that. Not sure why that wasn't coming up. But yeah, so this is the name of the paper. If you do a Google search on dragon blood, I'm sure you're going to find it. Give me just a moment here. I'll post a link real quick here. This is a link not only just to this paper, but a whole background on this little website that was set up by the paper's authors. But essentially, they explain in here how there are vulnerabilities in this in the passphrase, how the passphrase can be exploited. As you can see, there's a lot of kind of complicated math here and such. It mentions kind of how this can be done. But there are definitely limits there. In most real world scenarios, these types of attacks aren't possible because the attack relies on being able to keep the client device from being able to hear the access point while the attack is occurring. And that's not something that's particularly plausible, I would say, nowadays. If my phone is in an office somewhere or at home for that matter, and I'm trying to connect with WPA3 Personal, someone could definitely launch this Dragon Blood attack, but the Dragon Blood attack wouldn't be successful. It wouldn't be able to capture my passphrase if my real access point or my real wireless router was still able to be heard by my phone. So as long as my phone can continue to hear my real device, it kind of sabotages the efficacy of the attack. So, it's technically an attack. That's why I say that it's something that makes passphrases more difficult. That's why I'm kind of using that term, more difficult. I'm not saying impossible, because this attack does exist, and if you read that paper, the math kind of checks out and everything. If you know the standards, the math kind of checks out, but definitely makes it a little bit more difficult to attack. But a key thing here is this is personal only. WPA3 Enterprise is not affected. WPA3 Enterprise has no known authentication attacks. So, assuming you have a secure authentication setup, assuming your EAP setup is secure, and I should note, there are vulnerabilities with one type of EAP. There are PEEP vulnerabilities. I'm not saying that if you use PEEP, you gotta get rid. I mean, we used PEEP at USC. I assume that USC probably still does use PEEP, we certainly had no known occurrences of people's passwords being compromised via the Wi-Fi network, via using PEEP over the Wi-Fi network. But technically, there are ways to compromise a PEEP network, and so. It's essentially kind of a man-in-the-middle type thing. So that same man-in-the-middle vulnerability exists with WPA3 Enterprise as well as WPA2. But WPA3 Enterprise has no known authentication attacks that are beyond what WPA2 has. There's nothing that let's say makes EAP vulnerable or something like that. Okay. As far as securing the wireless communications, again, we kind of have the three areas to secure: the network, our wireless communications, and our devices. All types of authentication are helped by WPA3. Again, those three types are WPA3 Personal, WPA3 Enterprise, and then open networks. Unencrypted open networks. Those are our two and three different ways of connecting to wireless networks. When it comes to the open networks, there's our open Wi-Fi is now encrypted. So that's a little bit of a change. Before WPA3, open Wi-Fi networks did not have any Wi-Fi based encryption, did not have any layer 2 encryption. For our WPA2 personal networks, our data is more difficult to decrypt even if someone knows the passphrase. So that's a WPA3 personal thing. And this is another thing that's very similar to what I talked about with network security, where there's a theoretical vulnerability in that Dragon Blood attack that would make it so that if someone knows a WPA3 passphrase, they could potentially decrypt Wi-Fi traffic. But again, it's not likely in the real world. It's certainly there are no known examples of someone being able to execute this, even as a white hat attack in the real world, meaning on a real production Wi-Fi network. So what I want to say here is you know, passphrases can't be cracked. Data can't be decrypted anymore. But because of that Dragon Blood white paper, I'll crouch it a little bit. I'll say, you know, it's more difficult. And then for WPA3 Enterprise, 192-bit encryption. It's you know, it's a little bit of a tricky thing. It's effectively 192-bit encryption, but it is a little bit of a complicated topic. But we can essentially say longer encryption. With WPA2, the length of the encryption keys is 128-bit. So WPA2 gives us 128-bit encryption. WPA3 Enterprise only, not personal, but WPA3 Enterprise can allow for up to it's effectively 192-bit encryption. And then when it comes to device security, you know, our third type of security, evil twin attacks are more difficult. You know, man-in-the-middle attacks, that's what I'm talking about with evil twin, is essentially a man-in-the-middle attack. Those are more difficult, and that is with open Wi-Fi or with WPA3 personal Wi-Fi. So both with open and with WPA3 personal, evil twin attacks are more difficult. You know, attacks on by setting up a man-in-the-middle, setting up sort of a fake wireless access point are more difficult. And so that's kind of what WPA3 is offering us. And so if we step back a little bit and kind of think about it, essentially what this means is, and I'll try to summarize this here. If you use WPA3, if you use Wi-Fi in the enterprise, more or less, there is no change. There are no known vulnerabilities for 128-bit WPA2 AES encryption. Now, look, you know, I don't work at the NSA. I don't work for, you know, other countries, governments, where they may have access to things that can break 128-bit AES encryption. I haven't seen compelling proof that 128-bit AES encryption can be broken in any kind of short amount of time, but there's definitely a relatively large community of people who believe that 128-bit encryption can be broken. So I say no change, but I'll say no change unless you believe that 192-bit is secure and 128-bit AES isn't. You know, that's kind of the key there. So I happen to not be a believer in that. I happen to believe that 128-bit AES encryption is, you know, strong, but you know, maybe I'm wrong. It's possible that the folks who believe that, you know, the NSA or whoever else has a crack for 128-bit AES encryption, maybe they're correct. I don't have any proof one way or another. When it comes, so enterprise networks, no change. When it comes to WPA2 personal, it's essentially kind of the same method, but a little bit more secure. I'm still putting in a passphrase. That passphrase is still configured on my wireless router or wireless modem or wireless access point locally, meaning there's no server involved. It's just the passphrase cracking thing is no longer a real concern. People decrypting wireless traffic, or at least decrypting the WPA2 encryption on wireless traffic, is no longer a concern. Does that matter that much? Not really, in my opinion. Again, I'm kind of in the Bruce Schneier camp when it comes to this, that we really didn't need WPA2 personal in the first place. On residential networks, we don't really have that much valuable stuff where authentication is that big a deal. On residential networks, we are using HTTPS encryption, SSL-based email, you know, other uses of SSL. So we already have strong encryption at the application layer. And so adding encryption at the lower layers, adding encryption at the Wi-Fi layer is not as important, is not that big a deal. So to me, the WPA2 personal improvement is not that big a deal. But, you know, for some people, they may look at things differently. They may say, well, you know, I really was worried about my passphrase being broken. I'm happy that my passphrase no longer can be broken in the real world, at least. I'm happy that if someone knows my passphrase, that they can no longer decrypt my WPA2 authentication. You know, maybe I have some unencrypted stuff going over my wireless. So that would be a little bit different. And then for open security, the big difference is essentially what we're sort of getting is what I like to call mandatory SSL. Because the security method for open wireless with WPA3 is essentially the same thing as SSL, what SSL is doing. And, you know, I have the list here of all the WPA3 improvements. The improvement for open networks is OWE, or opportunistic wireless encryption. And OWE, or opportunistic wireless encryption, is just a classic Diffie-Hellman handshake. It's the same handshake and the same setup of an encryption key that's been used for decades in all sorts of network security, in internet-based security, in wireless security, in local network security. That's what OWE is. For those of you that may not be familiar with sort of your basic certificate security, you know, and again, this is what OWE provides, or opportunistic wireless encryption provides. The idea there is that you have a client, you have a server, and the client says, you know, can I connect? The server is going to have a little private key. The server is going to have a public key. And what the server is going to do is the server is going to send over this little certificate. And once the client receives this certificate, the client then has the ability to create an encryption key. This would be the little session key or the master key that I was talking about earlier on. So the client has the ability to create a key, and then the client can encrypt this key using the public key of the server. So, you know, this certificate is sent, and it is sent with the public key. So this key inside here is encrypted. This session key, or this master key, is encrypted using the public key of the server. That's sent back from the client to the server. And then the only way that this can be decrypted, the only way that the public key can be decrypted is with the private key. And the idea there is this private key never leaves the server. This private key is never sent anywhere. So you hopefully have some type of assurance that this private key can't be made vulnerable. So therefore, this key here is encrypted in a way where only the server can understand it. Only the server can decrypt this key and understand this key. Once that happens, once that's kind of sent over here and decrypted via the private key, now there's that session, or that master, if you want to call it, key. Now that is present on both sides. So now the client and the server both have this session key, or this master key, and now they can encrypt data. Now, when they communicate with each other, they use this key to encrypt data with one another. So that's the basic handshake, the basic exchange, and that's what OWE does. The key with OWE is it's an access point and it's a Wi-Fi client. That's the whole key there. The access point kind of acts as the server, and the access point allows encryption keys to be created between the client and the server. So very, very similar to SSL encryption. Look, it's not something that is going to fully make open Wi-Fi networks secure. There's still the possibility that someone could set up a man-in-the-middle access point, that someone could set up an evil twin access point. So someone could set up a bad guy access point and do the whole OWE with the bad guy access point. The idea, though, at least, is that each vendor can have their own implementation of OWE. So, let's say you have a Cisco wireless LAN. If you have a Cisco wireless LAN, then if someone is setting up, a software access point or a residential grade access point, let's say a Linksys or a Netgear access point, those access points wouldn't have the same OWE setup, and so the client is supposed to not connect to those access points. It's not supposed to seamlessly move from the Cisco network to the hacker's network because there will be a different OWE setup. That's the idea, at least with OWE, to kind of keep it a little bit secure. But yeah, so that's that's kind of a big thing that is happening for open Wi-Fi. For when it comes to the WPA2 personal improvements, that's done with something called SAE, or simultaneous authentication of equals. And in concept, it is very, very similar to how WPA2 did the four-way handshake. This is very, very similar to how the four-way handshake works with WPA2. Do I still have that up here? I think I might. No, I guess I don't. So, but I'll just draw up the four-way handshake real quickly, just at least in summary. So here's the way the four-way handshake works. I have a little client device. I have an access point. Remember that the client device and the access point both have to have that PMK, the pairwise master key. PMK is either from the WPA2 personal passphrase, or it is from the EAP authentication, either the session key or the master key that was used during that EAP authentication. So one way or another, the client device and the access point have this PMK. And the idea here is the way that this this happens, that this PMK can turn into encryption keys. So to make it so that both devices have this encryption key, there's 4 messages, and the first 2 messages involve an exchange of what are called nonces. This is called the supplicant nonce. This is called the authenticator nonce. Going back, the client device is called the supplicant. In WPA2, in 802.11i, the access point is called the authenticator. And these little nonce values are just the missing piece in allowing a PMK to create an encryption key, and allowing an encryption key to be created from a PMK. That's the idea there. So it's an exchange of these values, and it's like, once the access point knows the supplicant's nonce, now the access point can use the PMK and derive an encryption key. Once the client device knows the authenticator's nonce, then the client device can derive an encryption key by using the nonce, using the PMK, using a few other things as well. The issue with this, the reason why this was considered a problem, is if you have a hacker who captures these 2 nonces, then the hacker could potentially learn the encryption key. the hacker, if you're using WPA2 personal, the hacker could say, okay, if I already know this person's passphrase, if I've already hacked this person's passphrase, or if they've shared it with me willingly or whatever, if I know this passphrase, if the only missing thing between this PMK and getting an encryption key is the nonce, and if the PMK comes from that passphrase, then then I can find out what the encryption key is. So that's kind of the basic structure. So if you think about this structure, the way this structure works with SAE, with simultaneous authentication of equals, the SAE structure. The structure is, number one, I have, and the access point has a PMK. Both sides have a PMK. Number two is there's some type of exchange of info. And then number three is with the PMK, and the info that was exchanged, then an encryption key can be created. So that's kind of the idea there of WPA3, is that and so this is the structure for SAE for WPA3. This is also a similar structure for WPA2. I mean, that's kind of what I just drew. Just to quickly flip back to it again. Whoops. I have my access point has the PMK. Information is exchanged. From that information that was exchanged, I'm able to create the encryption key. The difference is just the math is a little bit different and apparently more complex, thus making it so that this encryption key cannot be recreated as easily offline. To be honest with you, the math is more complex than I'm able to understand, but I want to share with you at least a little bit. So this is straight from that Dragon Blood paper. I thought they did a really good job of kind of showing what's happening there. If you look at this Dragon Blood paper here, in order for our client device and our access point to be able to create the encryption key, the client device and the access point both have to have the equivalent of this PMK. If I remember correctly, that might be, was it this part? I might be wrong about that. It might be this part. It might be some other part. I forget what it is. But in order, there we go. The C. In order to create this is the encryption key. So in order to create this is our encryption key, the little CA or the CB. In order to create the encryption key, both the client device and the access point have to know the equivalent of the PMK, something, and that actually might have been this E might have been the equivalent of the PMK, but it has to know something that is is located on the access point or on the client device, and the client and the access point also have to know something that is exchanged. So these little S values and these little E values are exchanged. And so the idea there is the S values and the E values are used in this complicated mathematical equation to eventually create the encryption key. So we still have it set up where AP needs to know the passphrase, client needs to know the passphrase, AP needs to send something across. That's this first message, is it's coming from the AP to the client device. Client needs to send something across. That's this second message coming from the client device to the AP. So these messages have to be exchanged. The client and the AP both need to know the passphrase. And at the end, then the encryption key is created. And again, look, the math is more complicated than I understand, but from reading the paper, it appears that the math is complicated and is done in a way where it still allows the basic structure to be in place. That basic structure of AP and client both know the passphrase, they exchange information, and that allows encryption keys to be created. So that structure is still in place with WPA3. It's just the math is a little bit different, which makes it so that a hacker, someone from the outside looking in, does not have the ability to create that key themselves. A hacker cannot just listen to what's going through the air, listen to these commit messages, and then create the key. The hacker would have to know some additional information that is not revealed through the air in order to create the key. That's kind of the idea there. So according to the paper, remember, the paper that you can download at that link that I posted in the chat area, according to this paper here, there still is a way to do that decryption. There still is a way to decrypt data that was encrypted using WPA3 personal with this SAE, with this simultaneous authentication of equals thing. So apparently there's still a way to do it. It's just more difficult. And to be honest with you, I'm not sure if that part is real world doable as well. Usually when I see side channel leaks, typically that means an attack where the real network is going to have to be unheard. So what I'm saying there is, I don't think that the client device, if the client device is still connected and is still hearing the access point, that it's going to be able to, that the hacker is going to be able to decrypt. But admittedly, again, I'm not quite knowledgeable enough on the math part of things to be able to tell you intelligently. When it came to WPA2, and maybe it's just a matter of research, maybe I just need to spend a little bit more time on WPA3, but when it came to WPA2, I did know that part really, really well, and so then I could speak a little bit more intelligently and say, yeah, this potential hack, here's the scenarios where it could work, here's where it couldn't work. I'm not quite at that level with WPA3, so I can't help you quite as much. The other little thing about WPA3, we kind of mentioned one of these already. We mentioned the equivalent of 192-bit encryption only for WPA3 Enterprise, not for WPA3 Personal, not for open networks, but only for WPA3 Enterprise. And then the other part is making an older Wi-Fi protocol mandatory. MFP, or Management Frame Protection, it requires that management frames be encrypted. And the basic idea there is to prevent denial of service attacks. So, if we were to sum it up, what I would say is it's not bad to have WPA3. I wouldn't worry about having WPA2. So if I were to summarize it, here's the way I would think of it. If I use open Wi-Fi, let's say you are a Bruce Schneier type, and you say, for my home Wi-Fi network, I'm just going to keep the Wi-Fi open. I don't really care about encryption. I don't care about the neighbors connecting. For open Wi-Fi, you add SSL, but we kind of already had it at the application layer. We already had app layer SSL. So from my point of view, it's like, okay, I guess it'd be nice if my devices are supporting WPA3, but I don't really care about it that much. I already have encryption of my email, of my web traffic at virtually any app that runs on a smartphone or on a tablet or whatever device you're using, on a PlayStation. So I don't find there to be that much value in OWE. That's the protocol for open, but I don't find that much value. When it comes to WPA2 and WPA3 personal, the protocol there is SAE. What we're doing is we are preventing dictionary attacks on our passphrase-based authentication. And then we're preventing decryption on the the WPA2, the AES encryption. But do either of those really matter? The dictionary attack was a very simple attack with WPA2, but extraordinarily time consuming. Like, even if you use a WPA2 passphrase that's just your phone number, it's likely going to take months before a successful authentication happens. Maybe if someone knows your area code, maybe it would just take a few weeks. Maybe it might not take months or years. But the WPA2 personal dictionary attack is so slow. It's just, you hear sometimes about this stuff like, oh, rainbow tables make cracking so much faster. Rainbow tables don't quite apply to Wi-Fi authentication the way they do to like Windows Server authentication. It's two different authentication protocols. So it's such a slow attack that I don't really concern myself with. And then when it comes to the encryption, it's the same thing I was saying about Open. I already have application layer SSL, so I don't really care that much. And then for our third type of Wi-Fi connection for WPA2 Enterprise, the idea there is just kind of like a simulated longer AES key, longer encryption key. Does that really matter? There's definitely a community of people out there who believe that 128-bit AES is crackable. That's the essential question there. Do you believe that 128-bit AES is crackable? If you're in that community of folks, then maybe you say, okay, WPA3 might be a big improvement. For me, I'm a little bit more skeptical. So for me, I kind of say WPA2 does enough. So that's at least how I look at WPA3. Is it's a nice thing to have. I understand the protocols are kind of intending to improve areas that have, legitimate limitations or in some cases legitimate vulnerabilities. But would I consider it essential to have a WPA3 network? I really don't. I don't consider it essential for Open. I don't consider it essential for personal. I don't consider it essential for enterprise. That's at least my point of view. Again, I am more in that, hippie, libertarian, if you will, line of thinking of, we don't want to over-secure. You don't have to over-secure just to make yourself look tough or whatever. Sometimes there can be negative side effects of that, like with the 2FA thing, you're trying to make it super secure, but then you end up having unanticipated problems like Rogers is having up in Canada with some of their cell phone SIM theft. So that's at least my point of view on it. We've already gone over 90 minutes. I know I probably spent too much time earlier on chit-chatting about stuff that was less relevant to WPA3. What I'm going to do is I'm going to wait for another session. We might do this next week. We might do it a little bit later. But I want to talk about security a little bit more. Rather than technical, talk about it a little bit more conceptual. Talk about things that go beyond WPA3 that we might use and what they're supposed to do, why we want those things. So I'm going to save this for another time. As you can see, I made this little quick chart, but what I'll do is I'll expand upon this and talk about this a little more. I might not do it right away next week, 2 straight weeks with very little application stuff. I don't know if that really fits in with Twitch very well. One of the things I like about Twitch is that you have the ability to kind of run and share applications. I don't really have the ability to like run and share a security application with you all. And so for that reason, it's a little bit more of kind of a lecture or a presentation. And I don't know if I want to do that 2 weeks in a row, but later on, it might not be next week. It might be a week or two later, but I will definitely go through security from a more conceptual perspective. Hope you enjoyed. I didn't get any chat messages today. Maybe that's a sign that, nobody cares about Wi-Fi security. That's very possible. But I do appreciate you joining. And as always, if you have topics that you would like to recommend, you can always send those in on Twitter. You can always send those in via email, however you want to contact me, send them into the chat area or send me a message here on Twitch. And I'm always happy to go into user suggested topics, or to a viewer, I guess I should say, suggested topics. You're not using, you're viewing. But yeah, so thanks again for joining. I will see you back here next Wednesday, 22nd of January. And yeah, we'll do more Wi-Fi streaming. And topic TBD. Might be security. We might do something else. I know there's a very interesting certification that is in beta starting next week. The AWA certification. I think it's accredited wireless adjuster, if I remember correctly. Let me get a link for you all. Give me just a second here. If I can find a quick link. Yeah, it's there's like a beta class happening. Here we go. Yeah, the accredited wireless adjuster, I think, is the name of the certification. I may be wrong on that. My pal Devin Aiken may have to correct me on that. But it's a certification that deals heavily with tools that I really like. These scanning tools. Wi-Fi Explorer is probably a preferred one of mine. If you've joined me before, you may have seen me using Wi-Fi Explorer. And so that's at least what I was planning to talk about next week, is maybe a little bit about AWA, a little bit about those tools. Hopefully I'll get a chance to get down to Atlanta to go to the AWA beta. I got to figure that out still. I know it's kind of last minute, but I'm hoping to get down there. And if I am able to get down there, definitely on Wednesday, I'll make sure I talk about that on the stream. All right, have a good one, y'all. I'll see you back here next week, same time, 10 a.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. UK time.